Have you ever heard the story about the cattle rancher who saved the Indian girl in the snowstorm? He gave her his only blanket and received a surprise gift in return. The biting wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the icy sting of a full-blown blizzard. Elias Vance hunched deeper into his saddle, pulling his worn coat tighter. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to keep moving, to find shelter, to escape this unforgiving landscape. The thought of the warmth of a distant hearth, the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee, was a potent, almost maddening lure. He urged his horse Thunder forward, the sturdy animal pushing against the deep snow with a weary but determined gait. The world around him was a swirling vortex of white, the familiar landmarks swallowed by the relentless storm. He had faced many blizzards in his years on the frontier, but this one felt different, more insidious, as if the very air itself was trying to steal his breath and his resolve. But then he saw her. A huddled form barely visible through the swirling snow slumped against a rock face. An Apache woman. His mind immediately flashed back to the warnings he'd heard in every dusty saloon and around every flickering campfire. Tales of Apache raiders, of brutal violence that followed wherever their paths crossed with settlers. The unspoken rules of the frontier, etched into every man's soul: helping the wrong person could get you killed. A cold knot of fear, distinct from the physical chill, tightened in his stomach. He was a man who prided himself on his self-reliance, his ability to navigate the treacherous currents of this wild land alone. To involve himself with a stranger, especially one from a people so often demonized, felt like an act of profound foolishness. Yet looking down at her, seeing her shivering, vulnerable form, all those warnings felt distant, meaningless. Her deerskin dress, though thick, was clearly inadequate against the ferocity of the storm. Her hair, dark and matted with snow, clung to a face that was alarmingly pale, almost blue. There was a faint, ragged cough that escaped her lips, a sound that spoke of deep distress and the encroaching grip of hypothermia. Elias's gut twisted. He couldn't just leave her to freeze. The image of his own mother, frail in her later years, flashed into his mind, a fleeting but powerful reminder of shared human vulnerability. He knew with a certainty that bypassed logic that he would carry the burden of leaving her to die if he rode past. With a sigh that turned to vapor in the frigid air, he dismounted. The snow was already knee-deep, making every step a struggle. Each breath burned in his lungs, and the wind whipped at his face, stinging his exposed skin. He unwrapped the thick wool blanket from his bedroll. It was his best possession, the only thing truly keeping him warm during these brutal nights on the trail. His grandmother, bless her soul, had made it years ago, before the fever took her. The blue and gray pattern was faded now, but it still held heat like nothing else he owned. It was more than just wool. It was a piece of home, a tangible link to a softer past, to a time when life felt simpler, less harsh. He remembered the feel of his grandmother's calloused hands as she taught him to mend a torn shirt, her quiet strength a constant comfort. This blanket carried the essence of that comfort, a warmth that transcended mere fabric. Without a word, he knelt beside her and gently wrapped the blanket around her trembling shoulders. He moved slowly, deliberately careful not to startle her, his movements a silent offering of peace. She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide with surprise, as if kindness from a white man was the absolute last thing she expected. A flicker of something unreadable passed through them. Perhaps suspicion, perhaps a cautious hope. Her fingers, stiff and numb with cold, gripped the edges of the blanket, gratefully clutching it like a lifeline. He saw the faint blue tinge on her fingertips, a stark indication of how close she had been to succumbing to the elements. "You'll be all right," Elias murmured softly, his voice rough with concern, though he wasn't sure she understood a single word of English. He hoped the tone, the gentle touch conveyed his intent. Her breathing, ragged moments before, began to steady as the warmth seeped into her body. Color slowly, miraculously returned to her pale cheeks, a faint blush replacing the deathly pallor. She studied his face with those penetrating dark eyes, and for a moment something profound passed between them that neither of them fully understood. A silent acknowledgement, a shared moment of humanity against the indifferent fury of the storm, a recognition of shared vulnerability in a world that often seemed intent on tearing them apart. It was a connection forged not in words, but in the raw, elemental struggle for survival. He helped her to her feet, her movements still a little clumsy, and guided her to a more sheltered spot behind a cluster of large rocks. The wind was less fierce there, a slight reprieve from its relentless assault, and the snow didn't whip quite so violently. Elias quickly gathered what little dry kindling he could find. small brittle branches tucked beneath the snow-laden pines, and built a small fire, the flames eagerly licking at the wood, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. The warmth radiated outward, pushing back the cold, a small but defiant beacon in the vast wilderness. He shared what little food he had, some dried jerky tough and salty, and a few hard biscuits, crumbly but filling. The woman who pointed to herself and said Luna ate slowly, deliberately, never taking her eyes off him. She seemed to be memorizing every detail of his face, every line, every shadow, as if trying to decipher the true nature of this unexpected savior. It was an unnerving, yet oddly captivating gaze, a silent question that Elias couldn't answer. As the blizzard raged around them, they sat in comfortable, almost companionable silence. The fire crackled, a tiny beacon of defiance against the vast, cold wilderness. Elias found himself stealing glances at her, his mind buzzing with questions. Who was she? How had she ended up alone in such a deadly storm? Where was her family? The frontier was a harsh mistress, and lone travelers, especially women, rarely survived its cruelties without a strong support system. But those questions would have to wait. Survival came first. He focused on keeping the fire fed, on the simple, immediate task of staying alive. The shared silence, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the wind, began to feel less like a void and more like a bridge, a quiet understanding forming between them. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and pale orange, a tentative light filtering through the lingering clouds, Luna stood. Her movements were fluid now, her strength returned, a quiet grace in her bearing. She carefully folded the blanket, smoothing out the wrinkles, and held it out to him. Elias shook his head. The biting cold had passed, and he had his thick canvas coat. He felt a pang of reluctance to part with the blanket, a piece of his grandmother, but the logic was clear. She needed it more than he did, especially if she was still out here alone. His act, he believed, was one of simple, practical charity. Her eyes widened at his refusal to take it back. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice urgent, almost worried, gesturing between the blanket and herself, then pointing at him. He couldn't understand a single word, but her tone conveyed a sense of deep concern, even alarm, as if he had just committed a grave error. He just smiled, a reassuring if clueless grin, and mounted his horse. "Keep warm," he called back as he rode away, the words feeling utterly inadequate, a flimsy farewell to a profound encounter. He genuinely thought he'd done a good deed, a simple act of charity, and would never see her again. He felt a quiet satisfaction, a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the sun now breaking through the clouds. He had done the right thing. But as Luna watched him disappear into the morning mist, she clutched the blanket tighter. In her culture, what had just happened meant something very different than what the kind cowboy believed. It was not merely an act of compassion. It was a declaration, a binding promise. And by sunset, her people would come looking for answers that would change both their lives forever. The weight of the blanket in her hands felt heavier, now imbued with a significance Elias could not fathom. Elias reached the trading post by mid-afternoon, the chill of the morning still clinging to his bones, but his mind was already replaying the encounter with the Apache woman. Something about those eyes haunted him. The way she'd looked at him when he refused to take the blanket back, almost like she was trying to warn him about something. A shiver unrelated to the cold ran down his spine. He dismissed it as the lingering effects of the blizzard, a trick of his tired mind. He was a man of logic and practicality, not one to dwell on premonitions. The trading post, a sturdy log and stone structure, sat nestled in a small valley surrounded by towering pine trees, their branches heavy with fresh snow. A thin wisp of smoke curled lazily from its stone chimney, promising warmth and the familiar, comforting smells of civilization. Inside, the heat hit him like a physical wall, chasing away the last remnants of the blizzard's bite. The air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco, cheap whiskey, and the faint, comforting aroma of wood smoke. 3 other men huddled around a rough-hewn table, playing cards, their faces grim and focused. Old Man Tiber, the grizzled old trader, looked up from cleaning his rifle. His eyes narrowed in surprise, a faint smile creasing his weathered face. Elias Vance, Old Man Tiber drawled, setting down his weapon with a clatter that echoed in the quiet room. "Didn't expect to see you until spring. That storm nearly killed my horses. Thought you'd be holed up somewhere sensible. Had to push through," Elias replied, unbuttoning his coat, the words feeling heavy on his tongue, a slight tightness in his chest. "Got business in Santa Fe that won't wait." needed to make up for lost time. Old man Tiber poured him a cup of coffee. The liquid was steaming black and bitter, but Elias wrapped his cold hands around the tin cup, feeling the warmth seep into his numb fingers, finally feeling human again. The warmth made him think of Luna, wondering if she'd made it to safety. If she was warm, a fleeting concern he tried to push away. He had done his part. See any trouble on the trail, Silas? A thin man with nervous eyes and a nasty scar that bisected his jaw asked, laying down a card with a snap. Apache have been moving through these parts. Folks are getting spooked. Heard tell of a few skirmishes. Elias hesitated, the coffee suddenly tasting sour in his mouth. His first instinct was to mention Luna, to describe the desperate situation he'd found her in, to perhaps even seek advice. But something held him back. These men wouldn't understand. They'd see only the danger, the perceived threat, not the frightened young woman who'd nearly frozen to death. They'd see a savage, not a human being in need of help. Their eyes held a hardness, a prejudice he knew well from years on the frontier. He decided to keep his counsel. "Nothing I couldn't handle," he said finally, his voice flat, betraying none of the turmoil churning inside him. He took a long sip of coffee, letting the bitterness cleanse his palate and his thoughts. Silas leaned back in his chair, a cynical smirk twisting his lips. Smart to keep moving. Last week they hit a wagon train 20 miles south, took everything, left the bodies for the buzzards. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into a brass spittoon with a loud clang. Animals, the lot of them. No different than wolves, just walk on two legs. Elias's jaw tightened. The word animals echoed in his head, a harsh counterpoint to the memory of Luna's grateful, vulnerable smile. Whatever those raiders had done, she wasn't part of it. She was just a woman who'd needed help. A woman he'd helped. He felt a quiet anger stir within him, a resentment at the easy judgment, the blanket condemnation of an entire people. Old man Tiber refilled his cup, his gaze assessing a flicker of something unreadable in his own eyes. "You can bunk here tonight. Got a room in the back, but I'd move on at first light if I were you. Been hearing drums in the hills. When they start drumming, trouble follows. Always does." As if summoned by his words, a rhythmic beating drifted through the valley, low and steady like a giant ancient heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. The sound was deep, resonant, vibrating through the very ground beneath their feet. The card game stopped abruptly. All eyes turned toward the windows, though there was nothing to see but the rapidly darkening sky, now a deep bruised purple. "There it is again," Silas whispered, his nervous eyes darting around the room, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his hip. "Been going on for hours. Closer now, too." Elias set down his cup, a cold knot forming in his stomach. The drumming seemed to be coming from multiple directions surrounding the valley, a deliberate encircling sound. It wasn't random. There was a pattern to it, a complex rhythm, like a conversation being held in a language he couldn't understand. A language of warning, perhaps, or of gathering, of an impending movement. It was a sound that spoke of purpose, of numbers, and of a power that made the small trading post feel suddenly very vulnerable. "Maybe they're just passing through," old man Tiber said, but his hand moved instinctively to his rifle resting on the counter beside him, his knuckles white. His eyes, usually so shrewd and calculating, held a flicker of genuine fear, a rare sight that spoke volumes. The bravado of the frontier men in the room seemed to evaporate, replaced by a palpable tension. The drumming stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt heavier, more ominous than the sound itself. It pressed in on them, a suffocating blanket of unspoken dread, amplifying every creak of the old building, every rustle of the wind outside. Elias found himself thinking about the blanket again, the one he'd given to Luna, and the urgent way she'd spoken to him when he refused to take it back. Had she been trying to tell him something important? A warning? A premonition? He had foolishly ignored. The thought pricked at him, a tiny, unsettling seed of doubt. "I'll take that room," he said, finishing his coffee in one gulp, the bitter liquid doing little to calm his churning insides. His voice sounded calmer than he felt, a practiced mask of indifference. He paid old man Tiber, his movements deliberate, trying to project an air of normalcy he didn't feel. But as he settled into the narrow bunk that night, sleep wouldn't come. The drums had started again, closer this time. A relentless primal thrum that vibrated through the very ground beneath him, through the rough wooden walls of the trading post. It was no longer a distant sound, but a presence, a living, breathing entity that surrounded them. And somewhere in that ancient rhythm, Elias could swear he heard his name being called, a ghostly echo in the night. Elias, Elias. The sound was not a whisper, but a resonant hum, a calling that seemed to penetrate his very bones. Outside, his window shadows moved between the trees. Not the random, aimless movement of animals, but the purposeful advance of people who knew exactly where they were going. People who were looking for someone. And in his gut, a cold, hard certainty settled they were looking for him. The realization was a punch to the stomach, a sudden chilling clarity that dispelled any lingering doubts. His act of kindness had, it seemed, entangled him in something far larger than he could have imagined. Dawn came too early and too quiet. The drumming had stopped some time before sunrise, leaving behind an unnatural silence that made his skin crawl. Even the birds seemed afraid to sing their usual morning chorus, replaced by an eerie stillness. Elias dressed quickly, his movements precise, his heart thudding a steady, anxious rhythm against his ribs. He felt a strange mix of fear and a grim determination. He wouldn't be caught unawares. He stepped outside to check on his horse, Old Thunder. The animal was restless, ears twitching at sounds only it could hear. Its nostrils flared, sensing the unseen presence. Thunder snorted, pawing at the ground, its unease mirroring Elias's own. Old Man Tiber emerged from the main building, rifle in hand, worry etched deep in his weathered face, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. "They're out there," Old Man Tiber said quietly, his voice barely a whisper, a strained quality to it. "Been watching us all night. Haven't seen them, but I can feel eyes on me. Like 1,000 needles pricking my skin. Never felt anything like it." Elias scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, not a leaf, not a shadow. The forest was an impenetrable wall of green and white, silent and watchful. But the feeling of being observed was unmistakable, palpable, like standing in front of a loaded gun, knowing it was aimed directly at his chest. Every hair on his arms seemed to stand on end. He saddled Thunder, every movement deliberate and calm, a practiced routine that helped to steady his nerves. Panic would only make things worse. He had to think to act, not just react. He checked his pistol, ensuring it was loaded and easily accessible, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. "I'm riding out," he announced, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands, a decision born of grim necessity. "No point staying here if they want something. Better to face it head on. No sense being cornered." "You're crazy," Silas hissed from the doorway, his face pale with fear, his eyes wide with disbelief. "They'll pick you off before you reach the ridge. You'll be buzzard bait by noon. They're waiting for you, plain as day." But Elias was already mounting up. Whatever was happening, whatever these Apache wanted hiding, wouldn't solve it. He'd rather face it in the open on his own terms than wait to be cornered like a rat in a trap. He took a deep breath, the cold air sharp in his lungs, and nudged Thunder forward. He rode slowly up the main trail, his hands visible, resting on the saddle horn well away from his holstered pistol, a deliberate gesture of non-aggression. The morning mist clung to the valley floor, making everything look ghostly and uncertain, blurring the edges of the familiar world. Thunder's hooves echoed off the canyon walls, the only sound in the oppressive quiet, each step a deliberate beat against the silence. The air was thick with anticipation, heavy with unspoken threats, a tension that hummed in his very bones. Then they appeared. 7 Apache warriors materialized from the trees like shadows given form, silent and swift, their movements fluid and precise. They didn't rush forward or raise weapons. They simply stepped into view and waited, blocking the trail ahead, a formidable, unyielding barrier. Their horses were painted for war-stark symbols against the pale morning, but the men themselves seemed calm, almost ceremonial. Their faces stoic, their eyes unreadable, holding a depth Elias couldn't fathom. Elias's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, a desperate, futile gesture, then stopped. These weren't raiders. Their posture was formal, almost dignified, not overtly threatening, but rather expectant, almost solemn. One of them, an older man with intricate beadwork on his buckskin shirt, his face etched with the lines of age and wisdom, raised his hand in a gesture that clearly meant stop. Elias reined in Thunder, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The older Apache spoke in his native tongue, his voice deep and resonant, carrying the weight of authority of generations of tradition. Behind him, the other warriors remained motionless, their dark eyes studying Elias with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under glass. Every flaw, every weakness exposed, every hidden thought laid bare. Then from behind the group, another figure emerged. Luna. She wore the same deerskin dress he'd seen her in yesterday, but now his blue and gray blanket, his grandmother's blanket, was draped over her shoulders like a ceremonial cloak. a symbol of something he didn't yet understand. It looked different on her, transformed, imbued with a new powerful meaning. Her eyes met his, and he saw something there that made his blood run cold. Not fear, not gratitude, but responsibility. Heavy, unavoidable responsibility. A burden he hadn't asked for but seemed to have inherited a weight that settled squarely on his shoulders. The older Apache spoke again, his voice firm, unwavering, his words carrying an undeniable finality. This time Luna translated her English, carefully pronounced each word, tinged with an accent that made it sound almost musical, yet chillingly clear, imbued with a solemnity that belied her youth. "My grandfather says you have claimed me as your wife," she said simply, her gaze unwavering, her expression unreadable, a quiet certainty in her voice. Thunder shifted beneath him, as if responding to Elias's shock, his utter disbelief. "What I never... The blanket..." Elias stammered, his voice cracking, a wave of confusion and alarm washing over him. The words felt foreign on his tongue, inadequate to express the sudden, overwhelming reality. Luna continued, her voice growing stronger, more resolute, as if reciting an ancient law, a truth that had been passed down through countless generations. "In our ways, when a man gives his blanket to protect a woman, he declares his intention to provide for her, always to be her husband. It is a sacred vow. A bond that cannot be broken." The words hit Elias like a physical blow, a punch to the gut, stealing his breath. He stared at the blanket, his grandmother's blanket, now transformed into something he'd never intended it to be. A marriage contract, written in wool and good intentions. A binding agreement he'd unwittingly entered into, a promise he had made without uttering a single word. The irony was bitter. The consequences terrifying. "That's not what I meant," he said desperately, his voice rising, a frantic edge to it. "I was just trying to help." She was freezing. It was an act of mercy, nothing more. He felt a surge of panic, a desperate need to explain, to undo this monumental misunderstanding. Luna's grandfather, Chief Stonehand, spoke again, his tone brooking no argument, his gaze piercing, unwavering, a man accustomed to his word being law. Luna translated, though her voice had become smaller, more vulnerable, as if the weight of his words pressed down on her too, a shared burden. He says, "Intentions matter less than actions. You saved my life and claimed me as yours. Now you must honor that choice." The blanket speaks for itself. The canyon walls seemed to close in around Elias, as the full crushing weight of his situation became clear. A simple act of kindness, a moment of human decency, had bound him to a woman he barely knew, in a culture he didn't understand, with consequences he couldn't even begin to imagine. His mouth went dry as dust. 7 pairs of dark, unblinking eyes watched him, waiting for an answer that could determine whether he lived to see another sunset. The morning air suddenly felt thin, making each breath a conscious, painful effort, as if the very atmosphere had become heavy with his dilemma. "I don't understand your ways," Elias said carefully, his voice echoing off the canyon walls, sounding foreign even to his own ears. A desperate plea for comprehension. "Where I come from, giving someone a blanket just means you don't want them to freeze to death. It's an act of compassion, not a proposal. There's a vast difference." Chief Stonehand, whom Luna called Nish, listened to the translation and responded with what sounded like a question, his weathered face remaining impassive, but his eyes held the sharpness of a man who'd survived by reading people's hearts, by seeing beyond words, to the truth, to the motivations that lay beneath. "He asks if you would have given the blanket to an Apache man," Luna translated, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes searching his, a quiet challenge in their depths. The question cut straight to the truth, a brutal, undeniable blade that sliced through Elias's carefully constructed defenses. He thought about it honestly, brutally. Would he have stopped for an Apache warrior, even one freezing to death? Would he have risked his own warmth, his own safety for someone who might have been his enemy? Someone he'd been warned against his entire life? The answer sat heavy in his chest, a bitter taste in his mouth, a recognition of his own ingrained prejudices. "Probably not," Elias admitted, the words barely audible, a whisper of shame. The shame burned, a hot flush rising to his cheeks, but the honesty was necessary, a painful but essential truth. Chief Stonehand nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he already knew, something he'd expected, a quiet validation of his own wisdom. He spoke again, his words flowing like water over stones, ancient and certain, carrying the weight of generations of a deep understanding of human nature. He says, You chose to see me as a woman first, Apache second. This shows honor, but honor carries responsibility. Great responsibility. It is a path you have chosen whether you knew it or not. One of the younger warriors, Hawk, a fierce-looking man with a braided queue and a hawk feather in his hair, shifted restlessly on his horse, his hand moving to rest on the hilt of his weapon, a glimmer of impatience and barely concealed aggression in his eyes. Elias caught the movement and felt a cold trickle of sweat snake down his spine despite the morning chill. These men weren't just here to talk. They were here to enforce their customs whatever the cost. His life, perhaps. What happens if I refuse? Elias asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. His voice was tight-strained, a desperate attempt to grasp the full extent of his predicament. Luna hesitated, her gaze dropping for a moment, a flicker of profound sadness in her eyes before she began to translate. The conversation that followed was rapid and intense, a flurry of guttural Apache words with several warriors joining in their voices, rising in what sounded like angry debate, a heated exchange of opinions. Elias watched their faces, trying desperately to read the emotions behind words he couldn't understand. Anger, defiance, a grim determination, a sense of righteous indignation. When they finished, Luna's face had gone pale, her lips trembling slightly, her eyes wide with a fragile vulnerability. "If you refuse," she whispered, her voice barely a thread, a breath of sound, "you dishonor not just me but my family. My grandfather would be obligated to—" She paused, searching for the right words in English, her eyes pleading with him to understand the gravity of her next statement, the terrible weight of their cultural code. "To restore our honor through blood. Your blood." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, thick and suffocating, a chilling finality to the words. Elias looked at each warrior in turn, seeing the grim resolution in their faces, the unyielding adherence to their code. They weren't bluffing. In their world, this wasn't negotiable. It was a matter of honor, of survival, of the very fabric of their society, a truth as immutable as the mountains around them. But then he looked at Luna, really looked at her. She stood straight and proud, a warrior's daughter, her chin held high, but beneath that brave facade he could see the fear she was trying desperately to hide. Fear of what would happen to him. Fear of what would happen to her family if violence erupted. If he chose to fight, fear of being caught between two worlds that didn't understand each other, that seemed destined to clash, a tragic pawn in a conflict not of her making, a choice, accept a marriage to save his life, but trap an innocent woman in a commitment she hadn't asked for, a life. She might not want a future. She might resent or refuse, and likely start a war, a bloody conflict that could destroy both of them and perhaps even her entire village, a ripple effect of violence that would spread far beyond this canyon. The weight of it pressed down on him, crushing, suffocating, a moral dilemma that tore at his very soul. "There has to be another way," Elias said finally, his voice hoarse, a desperate plea, a last gasp of hope. "Some test or trial I can undergo instead. Something to prove my worth, my intentions. A way to earn my place if that's what's required." Chief Stonehand's eyebrows raised slightly, the first crack in his stoic expression, a flicker of surprise in his ancient eyes. He spoke to Luna, who looked genuinely surprised by his response, a flicker of hope, fragile but real in her own eyes. "He says you speak like a warrior, not a coward. This is unexpected. You face our customs with courage." She paused, her gaze still fixed on him, a silent question. "He will consider your words. But first you must come to our village to understand what you are truly choosing, to see the life you would be entering, to know the people you would join." The young warrior Hawk, who'd been fingering his weapon, spoke harshly, his voice laced with clear disagreement, with barely contained fury, his eyes burning with resentment. Chief Stonehand silenced him with a sharp look and what sounded like a stern rebuke, a quiet but firm assertion of his authority. "My cousin believes you should be forced to choose now, Luna," explained her voice low, almost apologetic, a hint of weariness in her tone. "He thinks you will try to escape if given time, that this is a trick. He does not trust you." Elias met Hawk's hostile glare, his own jaw tightening, a spark of defiance in his eyes. He could see the barely contained violence there, the raw desire to solve this problem with blood instead of words. One wrong move, one sign of disrespect, and this canyon would become a battlefield, his grave. He held Hawk's gaze, a silent challenge, a refusal to back down. "I give you my word," Elias said, addressing Chief Stonehand directly, his gaze unwavering, trying to convey the sincerity he felt, the depth of his commitment. I won't run. I will come to your village. I will face your trials. I will prove my intentions. As Luna translated, Elias realized he'd just committed himself to something far more dangerous than a simple marriage proposal. He'd agreed to enter an Apache village surrounded by people who had every reason to hate him, to face customs and trials he couldn't even imagine, a journey into the unknown. But as they began to ride deeper into the mountains, following the silent warriors, one thought echoed in his mind, a new, unexpected resolve. He was no longer just trying to save his own life. Somehow, without meaning to, he'd become responsible for saving Luna's as well, for honoring the unintended promise of his grandmother's blanket. The Apache village materialized from the rugged landscape like a mirage, becoming real. A hidden world suddenly revealed. Hidden deep in a secluded valley between towering red cliffs, it was larger than Elias had expected, a vibrant living community. Dozens of traditional dwellings, wickiups and hogans, were scattered along a clear rushing stream, their rounded forms blending seamlessly with the natural contours of the land. Smoke curled lazily from cooking fires, carrying the faint, savory scent of roasting meat, and the distant sound of children's laughter echoed off the canyon walls. A deceptively peaceful sound that belied the tension Elias felt. But as their group approached, the laughter stopped. Faces appeared in doorways and from behind trees, their expressions shifting from curiosity to caution. Men, women, children, all watching the white man who rode among their warriors, their eyes following his every move. Some expressions showed curiosity, a hesitant wonder, a quiet assessment. Others, like hawks, barely concealed outright hostility, a simmering resentment, a deep-seated suspicion. Elias felt like a wolf walking into a sheep pen, except he wasn't sure who was the predator here. The air grew heavy with their silent judgment, a palpable weight that pressed down on him. Chief Stonehand led them to the center of the village, where a large fire pit was surrounded by logs arranged in a perfect circle, a place of gathering and ceremony. An elderly woman emerged from the largest dwelling, her silver hair braided with turquoise beads, her face a roadmap of ancient wisdom and hard-won experience, every line telling a story. Her eyes sharp as obsidian, fixed on Elias with an intensity that made him want to look away, to shrink into himself, to disappear. My grandmother Luna said quietly, a hint of apprehension in her voice, a slight tremor. Elder ancient whisper. She is not pleased. Her wisdom is deep, and her sight is keen. Ancient whisper spoke rapidly to Chief Stonehand, her voice rising with what was clearly anger, her words sharp, cutting through the air like knife blades, a torrent of disapproval. She gestured toward Elias several times, her disapproval palpable, her hand movements emphasizing her displeasure. Other villagers began to gather, forming a loose circle around the fire pit, their murmurs growing louder, their expressions mirroring Elder Ancient Whisper's displeasure. A growing chorus of discontent. What's she saying? Elias asked, his throat tight, his voice barely a whisper. Luna's face flushed with embarrassment, her gaze dropping to the ground, a sign of her discomfort. She says you smell like whiskey and violence. That bringing you here puts the whole village at risk. That you are a danger to our people, a foreign element. She paused, her voice barely a whisper, imbued with a deep sadness. She also says I have brought shame on our family by accepting gifts from a stranger, by allowing myself to be claimed by an outsider, by breaking our traditions. The crowd grew larger and more agitated, their murmurs turning into a low hum of discontent, a rising tide of disapproval. Elias could pick out individual voices now, some arguing fiercely, others demanding answers, their tones accusatory, filled with suspicion. A young man about his own age pushed forward, his face contorted with anger, speaking directly to Luna with obvious passion, his words a rapid-fire assault. She shook her head repeatedly, her hands clasped tightly, but he persisted, his words a torrent, his frustration clear. Who's that? Elias asked, though the raw jealousy blazing in the man's eyes made the answer painfully obvious. Hawk Luna's voice was barely audible, laced with a mix of fear and resignation, a quiet despair. He has asked for my hand many times. He believes I should be his. Hawk stepped closer to Elias, his hand resting menacingly on the knife at his belt, his eyes burning with hatred, a predatory glint in their depths. He spoke in English, the words heavily accented but clear enough, dripping with venom, each syllable a deliberate insult. You take what is not yours, white man. You defile our customs. You bring dishonor. Leave now, or I will cut out your lying tongue and feed it to the coyotes. This is my warning. The threat sent a ripple of tension through the crowd, a collective intake of breath. Elias felt the crushing weight of every eye upon him, every breath held, every muscle tensed. One wrong word, one aggressive move, and this would explode into violence, a bloodbath that would destroy any chance of peaceful resolution of survival. He stood his ground, meeting Hawk's gaze, a quiet defiance in his own eyes. "I didn't take anything," Elias said calmly, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, a quiet assertion of his truth. "I gave something. There's a difference. A big difference. It was an act of kindness, not theft." Hawk's face darkened, his jaw clenching, his anger barely contained. "You gave nothing. You trick sacred customs for your pleasure, then run back to your people laughing at our traditions. You mock us." Before Elias could respond, Elder Ancient Whisper stepped between them, her small frame radiating an unexpected authority, a quiet power that commanded respect. She spoke sharply to Hawk, her voice like cracking ice, and he reluctantly backed away, though his eyes never left Elias's face, promising retribution, a silent vow of vengeance. Then she turned her attention to her granddaughter, her voice heavy with disappointment, with a profound sadness that seemed to weigh on Luna. Luna's shoulders sagged as she listened, her head bowed, her spirit seemingly crushed. When Elder Ancient Whisper finished speaking, tears glistened in the young woman's eyes, a silent testament to her pain. "She says I must choose, Luna," whispered, her voice choked with emotion, a fragile plea. "Either prove that your intentions are honorable by completing the marriage trials, or admit that I was foolish and accept Hawk's proposal instead. To save my family from shame. To restore our standing." The marriage trials, Elias felt his stomach drop, a cold dread spreading through him, a realization of the formidable task ahead. "What kind of trials?" "3 tests, Luna explained, her voice strengthening as she spoke, a flicker of defiance returning to her eyes, a renewed resolve. "Strength, wisdom, and sacrifice. If you fail any of them," she didn't need to finish. The alternative was written in the hostile faces surrounding them, in Hawk's eager, predatory expression. Failure meant death, and success was looking more impossible by the minute, a distant, shimmering mirage. Chief Stonehand spoke again, and the crowd fell silent, his voice carrying the authority of law itself, of ancient tradition, of a power that had guided his people for centuries. "He says the trials begin at sunset." Luna translated, her gaze meeting Elias's, a silent challenge, a shared destiny. "And if you try to leave before they're completed, Hawk has permission to hunt you down. He will not fail. His honor demands it." Elias looked around the circle of faces, some hopeful, a few curious, but most eager for his failure, for the swift, bloody resolution they desired, a grim satisfaction in their eyes. But it was Luna's expression that decided him. Behind the fear and uncertainty, he saw something that reminded him why he'd given her the blanket in the first place. She was worth protecting, worth fighting for, even if he didn't fully understand why. A primal instinct, a sense of rightness settled deep within him, a quiet conviction that superseded fear. "Then I guess we'd better get started," Elias said, his voice firm, a newfound resolve hardening his jaw, a quiet determination that surprised even himself. He would face whatever came. As the sun began to sink behind the towering canyon walls, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and crimson, the entire village gathered around the central fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the redstone cliffs, turning the peaceful valley into something primal and ancient, a stage for a drama centuries old, a timeless ritual. Elias stood at the edge of the circle, watching the Apache prepare for what felt more like a funeral than a wedding ceremony, the air thick with anticipation, with the unspoken weight of his impending tests. Chief Stonehand approached, his movements slow and deliberate, carrying 3 objects: a thick braided rope, its fibers worn smooth in places; a piece of carved dark wood covered in intricate symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight, an ancient enigmatic puzzle; and a small leather pouch that clinked softly when he moved its contents, a mystery. He set them down near the fire and began to speak, his voice carrying over the crackling flames, clear and resonant, imbued with the wisdom of his years. "The first trial tests your strength, Luna," translated, standing beside Elias, her presence, a silent comfort, a quiet anchor in the swirling uncertainty. "You must climb the sacred cliff face using only this rope, reach the eagle's nest and bring back a feather. It is a climb that demands every ounce of your being." Elias looked up at the towering wall of stone that rose behind the village, a sheer, unforgiving monolith that seemed to scrape the very sky. Even in the fading light he could see it was nearly vertical with few visible handholds and loose rock that would crumble under weight. The eagle's nest was a dark smudge, a tiny precarious tangle of sticks and bones perched about 60 feet up, impossibly high, and dangerously exposed, a testament to the eagle's daring. Men have died attempting this, Luna added quietly, her voice laced with genuine concern, a tremor of apprehension. Even our own warriors sometimes fail. It is a test of true grit, not just muscle. It tests the spirit within. Hawk stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear his words, a sneering challenge dripping with contempt. He gestured toward the cliff with obvious disdain, clearly suggesting that the white man would never succeed where Apache warriors had failed, that he was inherently inferior. He says you will fall like a stone, Luna translated, her voice flat, conveying the full weight of the insult, the biting scorn, that your soft hands have never held anything harder than a whiskey bottle, that you are weak and unworthy. You are not one of us. The insult stung because it wasn't entirely wrong. Elias was strong enough, years of ranch work had seen to that, his muscles honed by hard labor, but rope climbing wasn't exactly a common skill for cowboys. Still, he'd been in tighter spots. At least he hoped he had. He took a deep, steadying breath, pushing aside the sting of the words. He stripped off his coat and hat, feeling the evening chill bite at his skin, a sharp contrast to the heat radiating from the fire. The rope was rough hemp thick and unyielding, worn smooth in places by the hands of previous climbers, some of whom had never returned, their failures etched into the very fibers of the rope. As he tested its strength, pulling against it, he could feel the weight of every eye in the village watching him, their hopes and doubts pressing down on him, a collective breath held in anticipation. The first 20 feet went easier than expected. His arms and shoulders burned a familiar ache, but years of hauling hay, breaking horses, and wrestling cattle had given him a raw, stubborn strength. He didn't know he possessed a deep well of resilience. The rope bit into his palms, drawing blood, but he kept climbing, one hand over the other, his boots scrambling for purchase on the unforgiving cliff face, seeking out every tiny ledge, every minuscule crack, every imperfection that could offer a foothold. Halfway up, his luck ran out. A section of rock, seemingly solid, crumbled away beneath his left foot, sending a shower of pebbles cascading down into the firelight below, a small avalanche of failure. His foot slipped, leaving him swinging free on the rope, suspended precariously between the earth and the darkening sky, a dizzying void beneath him. The crowd below gasped, a collective intake of breath, a ripple of alarm. Elias heard a sharp cry, someone, maybe Luna, calling out his name, a desperate sound carried on the wind. His shoulders screamed in protest as they took his full weight, the muscles straining, threatening to tear, a searing pain that shot through his body. For a moment he hung there, spinning slowly, looking down at the upturned faces below, a dizzying array of expressions. Hawk was smiling, a cruel, triumphant grin, already anticipating his failure, his inevitable plunge, a silent cheer for his demise. But it was Luna's expression that drove him upward. Not fear for him, not pity, but fierce determination. A raw, unyielding will, a silent command. It was as if she was climbing the cliff herself through sheer force of will, her spirit urging him on a powerful, unspoken connection. Her eyes were locked on his, a silent promise, a powerful surge of energy that flowed into his aching limbs, a renewed strength born of her unwavering belief. He found new footholds, digging his boots into tiny crevices, his fingers finding purchase on the rough rock, and continued his agonizing ascent. The eagle's nest loomed above him, a dark, tangled mass of sticks and bones built precariously on a narrow ledge. As he reached for it, a massive golden eagle burst from the shadows, talons extended, wings beating furiously around his head, a feathered whirlwind of fury, its eyes burning with primal rage. It screamed its outrage, a piercing cry that echoed through the canyon, a challenge to his intrusion. Elias ducked narrowly, avoiding its strike, nearly losing his grip, as the powerful bird circled, screeching, its shadow passing over him like a dark omen. Its talons raked across his shoulder, tearing his shirt and drawing blood, a sharp, stinging pain that served as a reminder of the wildness of this place. But there, caught in the thorny branches of the nest, was a single perfect feather, gleaming golden brown in the last rays of twilight, a prize hard won. He lunged, grabbed at his fingers closing around the delicate quill, and began his descent, muscles trembling with exhaustion, every fiber of his being screaming in protest. Every foot downward was agony, a slow burning torture, but he refused to let go. He would not fail. He would not let Luna down. When his boots finally touched the ground, his legs buckled and he collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, his body shaking uncontrollably, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. The village erupted in surprised murmurs, a wave of hushed astonishment, a collective gasp of disbelief. Even Hawk looked stunned, his smug expression replaced by grudging disbelief that the white man had succeeded, a flicker of reluctant respect in his eyes. Elias held up the eagle feather, its golden-brown surface gleaming triumphantly in the firelight, a symbol of his hard-won victory. Chief Stonehand took the feather and examined it carefully, his fingers tracing its delicate barbs before nodding his approval, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He spoke briefly, his voice still solemn but with a hint of something new, a quiet acknowledgement of Elias's achievement. Luna translated with obvious relief, a tremor of emotion in her voice, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and gratitude. He says the eagle fought you, but you persevered. You showed courage. The first trial is complete. You have proven your strength. But before Elias could even catch his breath, before the adrenaline had fully receded, Chief Stonehand picked up the carved wooden piece. It was covered in intricate symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight, an ancient enigmatic puzzle, its meaning hidden to Elias. The second trial tests your wisdom, Luna said, her voice growing tense again, the relief from the first trial already fading, replaced by a new apprehension. You must solve the riddle of the ancestor stone before the fire burns down to embers. You must understand its meaning, its lesson. It is a test of your spirit, not just your mind. Elias looked at the symbols, then at the fire. It was large now, a roaring blaze casting long dancing shadows, but wood burned fast in the dry mountain air. He had maybe an hour, probably less, before the flames dwindled to nothing, before time ran out. His mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of the task, the impossibility of deciphering an unknown language in such a short time. What happens if I can't solve it? He asked, his voice barely a whisper, a desperate, raw question. Luna hesitated, her eyes filled with a fresh wave of apprehension, a deep sadness. Then you have failed 2 trials, and failure means... She didn't finish. But the answer was written in Hawk's eager, hungry expression in the grim faces of the villagers. Failure meant death, and success was looking more impossible by the minute, a cruel twist of fate. As Elias stared at the ancestor stone, turning it over in his bleeding hands, the rough wood, a stark contrast to his raw, abraded skin, trying desperately to make sense of symbols that might as well have been written by aliens, one thought. Echoed in his mind a chilling whisper. How do you solve a riddle when you don't even understand the language it's written in? The symbols seemed to mock him with their ancient mystery, their impenetrable meaning. The fire crackled lower, each spark that died, taking him closer to failure, closer to his inevitable end. Around the circle, villagers whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, their faces etched with pity or disdain, as if his defeat was already certain, a foregone conclusion. The symbols were unlike anything he'd seen before. Some looked like animals, a bear, an eagle, what might have been a snake. Others resembled natural features, mountains, rivers, the sun and moon. But how they connected, what story they told, remained as impenetrable as the cliff he'd just climbed. His mind raced, trying to find a pattern, a logic, anything to grasp onto, a desperate search for meaning. Can you give me a hint, Elias? Asked Luna desperately. His voice strained, his eyes pleading, a raw vulnerability in his tone. She shook her head, genuine sadness in her eyes, a silent apology. The wisdom trial must be completed alone. To help you would dishonor both of us. It must come from within you, from your own understanding. The ancestors speak only to the heart. Hawk spoke up from across the fire, his voice dripping with satisfaction, his words sharp and mocking, a cruel taunt. Even without translation, Elias could tell he was declaring victory, prematurely reveling in his perceived failure, a sneering triumph. Several villagers nodded in agreement, their faces grim, their belief in his failure solidifying. The fire burned lower, its flames shrinking, casting longer, more distorted shadows that danced menacingly on the canyon walls. Time was running out, a relentless, unforgiving march. Elias forced himself to think differently. Maybe the solution wasn't in understanding Apache symbols, but in understanding universal truths. Every culture had stories, patterns that repeated across time and place. Cycles. Life-death seasons. He studied the stone again, looking for familiar elements, for a glimmer of recognition, a thread to pull. There in the center, a spiral. It could represent the cycle of seasons, the endless turning of time, the ebb and flow of life. Around it, the animals he'd identified earlier, but now he noticed they were arranged in a specific order. The bear in the position where the sun would be in summer, powerful and dominant, a symbol of strength and abundance. The eagle where it would be in spring, soaring reborn, a symbol of renewal and vision. The snake where autumn would fall, shedding old skin, preparing for change, a symbol of transformation and adaptation. Seasons. Elias murmured aloud, a spark of an idea, igniting in his mind a sudden, thrilling surge of understanding. It's about the seasons, but that couldn't be the whole answer. There were other symbols, other elements that didn't fit the purely seasonal pattern. A figure that looked like a person standing at the very center of the spiral lines radiating outward from the human figure to each animal. Then it hit him, a sudden blinding flash of insight, a moment of profound clarity. Not just seasons, but the relationship between humans and nature through the seasons. The choices humans make in response to the world around them, their interaction with the natural world. The bear for summer when they hunted for food, to store taking what they needed sometimes by force, a symbol of necessary aggression. The eagle for spring when they needed its strength to build and grow, to reach for new heights, a symbol of ambition and aspiration. The snake for autumn when they prepared for the coming winter, shedding old ways like a snake shed its skin, adapting to survive, a symbol of letting go and resilience. And winter, there in the fourth position, was a symbol he'd missed before. Not an animal, but what looked like a blanket or maybe a shelter. Something that provided protection and warmth when the world turned cold, when life became harsh, a symbol of compassion and refuge. His heart began to race, a frantic drumbeat in his chest. This wasn't just a riddle about seasons. It was about his story, his journey to this place. The choices he had made. The riddle isn't asking what the symbols mean, Elias said aloud, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet circle, ringing with conviction, with a newfound certainty. It's asking why I'm here. He stood up, holding the stone toward Chief Stone Hand, his gaze fixed on his ancient, unreadable face. A silent challenge, a demand for recognition. Each symbol represents a choice. The bear, the choice to take what you need by force, to conquer, to dominate. The eagle, the choice to soar above others' suffering, to remain detached, to be indifferent. The snake, the choice to shed your responsibilities when times get hard, to abandon, to retreat. And the blanket. Elias paused, looking directly at Luna, her eyes wide with understanding. With a dawning realization, the choice to give warmth even when it costs you. To offer protection, to sacrifice for another, to extend kindness without expectation. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, a faint red pulse in the darkness. But Chief Stonehand held up his hand to stop the trial, his eyes gleaming with a new light, a profound understanding. He spoke quickly to Luna, who looked stunned by Elias's answer, tears welling in her eyes, a silent testament to the emotional impact of his words. He says, "You understand that wisdom isn't about knowing our symbols, but about knowing yourself." She translated, her voice choked with emotion, a mixture of awe and relief. The ancestor stone shows the 4 paths a man can take when faced with another's suffering. You chose the path of the blanket, the path of compassion and responsibility. You have seen the truth within yourself. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a wave of genuine surprise, a collective gasp of astonishment. Even Hawk looked stunned, his jaw slack, his face a mask of unexpected awe, his previous contempt replaced by a grudging respect. But Chief Stonehand wasn't finished speaking. "The second trial is complete," Luna continued, her voice gaining strength, a new hope blossoming within it, a quiet joy. "But Grandfather says, the third trial is the most dangerous. It tests not your body or mind, but your heart. It will ask you to give up what you hold dearest." Chief Stonehand picked up the leather pouch, and the clinking sound of its contents seemed ominous in the near darkness, a chilling prelude to what was to come. When he opened it, Elias saw it contained small bones, finger bones, carved with more symbols, ancient and unsettling, imbued with a mysterious power. "The trial of sacrifice," Luna whispered, her voice barely audible, a profound solemnity in her tone. "You must choose what you're willing to lose to gain what you claim to want. To truly become one of us. To truly belong." As the bones scattered on the ground in patterns only Chief Stonehand could read, Elias realized that surviving the first two trials might have been the easy part, because what was coming next would ask him to examine the one thing he'd been avoiding since this all began, what he truly wanted, and what he was willing to pay to get it. The ultimate test of his heart. The bone casting seemed to take forever, each moment stretching into an eternity, the silence heavy with anticipation. Chief Stonehand studied the pattern with the intensity of a man reading life and death in scattered fragments, his eyes piercing the veil of the unknown, seeking the deepest truths. The village held its collective breath, a tangible tension in the air as he finally spoke, his words heavy with the weight of ancient law, of irreversible fate, of a wisdom that transcended time. "The bones have chosen the sacrifice," Luna translated, her voice barely audible, trembling with apprehension, a profound sadness in her eyes. "You must give up the thing you value most in this world. Only then can you claim what you seek. Only then can you truly belong. Only then can you be truly free to embrace this new path." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air, a cold dread that settled deep in his soul. "What if I don't know what I value most?" he asked, his voice a desperate plea, a raw admission of his own uncertainty. Chief Stonehand smiled grimly, a knowing, almost pitying expression on his face, a silent understanding. He gestured toward Elias's horse, Thunder still saddled and waiting patiently at the edge of the village, a symbol of his freedom, his escape, his ability to ride away from all this. Then he pointed to the gun belt around Elias's waist, his pistol gleaming dully in the firelight. His protection, his power, his means of survival in a hostile world. Finally, his finger settled on the faded photograph, tucked into Elias's shirt pocket. A picture of his parents, the only thing he had left of his family, his past, his anchor to a life that no longer existed. "He says, a man always knows." Luna whispered, her eyes filled with a profound sadness, as if she understood the pain of the choice before him. The deep personal cost. The bones will reveal what you try to hide from yourself, what your heart truly clings to. The truth will be laid bare. Hawk stepped forward, speaking rapidly, and gesturing toward the scattered bones, his tone challenging, almost mocking a final attempt to undermine Elias. Several other villagers nodded in agreement with whatever he was saying, their faces reflecting his skepticism, their doubts still lingering. "My cousin says this is foolishness," Luna explained, her voice low, a hint of weariness. "That no white man would sacrifice anything real for an Apache woman. He believes you will choose to leave rather than give up what matters to you, that you are a coward, that your heart is not true." Elias looked at each item Chief Stonehand had indicated. His horse represented freedom, the ability to go anywhere, be anyone, to escape this impossible situation, to remain unburdened. His gun meant protection, the power to defend himself in a hostile world, to fight for his life, to assert his will. And the photograph, that was his past, his identity, the last tangible connection to who he'd been before this moment, before Luna, before this village. It was his anchor to a life that no longer existed, a comforting but ultimately binding link to a bygone era. But as he stood there, surrounded by faces lit by dying embers, by the weight of their expectations, and his own desperate need for understanding, he realized something that surprised him, something that shifted the very ground beneath his feet. None of those things felt as important as they had yesterday. The horse was just an animal, a means to an end, a tool for travel. The gun was just a tool, a way to inflict violence, a symbol of conflict. Even the photograph, precious as it was, represented people who were already gone, a past that could never be reclaimed, a memory that could live on without a physical token. What mattered was the living. What mattered was the woman standing beside him, her eyes fixed on his, her fate, intertwined with his, caught between worlds because of his actions, because of a simple act of kindness. Her quiet strength, her vulnerability, her courage in translating her grandfather's words, all spoke to him in a way that transcended logic. "I know what I have to sacrifice," Elias said quietly, his voice steady, imbued with a newfound clarity, a deep conviction that resonated through the silent village. He reached into his shirt and pulled out the photograph. His parents stared back at him from the faded paper, their smiles frozen in time. His father stern and proud, his mother gentle and kind. For years this image had been his anchor, the reminder of where he came from and who he was supposed to be. But holding on to the past meant he couldn't embrace the future. It meant he couldn't truly be here now with Luna fully present in this new reality. He walked to the fire pit and knelt beside the glowing embers, the heat a welcome warmth against his cold hands, a symbolic embrace of the transformation. "I sacrifice my old life," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the village, clear and resolute, a solemn declaration. "The man I was, the plans I had, the world I knew. I give it all up to become the man Luna deserves, to become the man your people can trust, to become a part of this new path." He placed the photograph on the coals. The paper caught fire, immediately curling and blackening the images of his parents, disappearing into smoke, dissolving into ash. The loss hit him like a physical blow. A sharp, profound ache in his chest, a tearing away of a part of himself, a severance from his past. But he didn't flinch or look away. He watched it burn, accepting the sacrifice, embracing the change, the smoke, carrying his old life into the night sky. The village erupted in surprised murmurs, a wave of stunned disbelief, a collective gasp of awe. Even Hawk seemed genuinely stunned by the gesture, his face, a mask of unexpected awe, his previous animosity replaced by a profound respect. But it was Luna's expression that mattered most. Wonder and something deeper, something that looked like the beginning of love shining in her dark eyes, a quiet, luminous hope. Chief Stonehand spoke again, his voice filled with a profound respect that hadn't been there before, a new warmth, a deep acknowledgement of Elias's true heart. He says, "You have proven yourself worthy." Luna translated, tears streaming down her face, her voice choked with emotion, a mixture of joy and relief. "Not because you completed the trials, but because you understood what they truly meant. Strength without wisdom is useless. Wisdom without sacrifice is meaningless. You have shown us your true heart. You are one of us." Elder Ancient Whisper, the grandmother who had been so hostile earlier, approached Elias with something in her hands. It was a new shirt made of soft deerskin, decorated with intricate beadwork in vibrant colors, a garment of acceptance. She spoke softly as she offered it to him, her sharp eyes now holding a hint of approval, even affection, a quiet warmth. She says, "Welcome to the family, son. You are one of us now." Luna whispered, her voice thick with tears of joy, a profound sense of belonging. As Elias put on the shirt, feeling the soft leather against his skin, he felt something shift inside him. The cowboy who had ridden into this valley no longer existed. In his place stood a man who had chosen love over freedom, connection over independence, future over past. A man reborn in the heart of the Apache, a new identity forged in the crucible of challenge and sacrifice. Hawk approached, his earlier hostility replaced by a grudging respect, a reluctant acknowledgement of Elias's worth, a quiet acceptance. He spoke briefly to Elias in English, his voice rough but sincere, a rare moment of direct communication. "You fight like Apache," he said, simply, his gaze steady, a nod of respect. "She chose well. You are worthy." As the village began to celebrate around them, a joyous cacophony of drums, singing, and laughter, Elias took Luna's hand. The blanket, his grandmother's blanket, was still draped over her shoulders, a constant reminder of how this all began, a silent witness to their journey. But now it meant something different than it had that snowy morning. Now it was exactly what the Apache had always seen it, as a promise. A commitment, a choice to put someone else's warmth before your own. A bond forged in hardship, sealed by sacrifice, a testament to a love that had blossomed unexpectedly. "Do you regret it?" Luna asked quietly, her voice soft, her eyes searching his, a gentle question. "Giving up your old life, all that you knew, the world you left behind." Elias looked into her dark eyes, seeing his future reflected there, a future he could never have imagined, yet now embraced with all his heart. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he'd chosen, a path forged by an act of unexpected compassion. And sometimes he realized the best decisions were the ones you made with your heart instead of your head. "The only thing I regret," he said, pulling her closer, feeling the warmth of her hand in his, a deep contentment settling over him, "is that it took me so long to understand what that blanket really meant. That it meant you. That it meant home." As the celebration continued around them, the drums beating a joyous rhythm, the voices rising in song, Elias knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. Learning Apache customs, finding his place in this tight-knit community building, marriage based on respect and love rather than just circumstance. But tonight, with Luna's hand in his and his grandmother's blanket wrapped around both their shoulders, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt like he was home. Sometimes it's the smallest acts of kindness that end up changing everything. The story of Elias Vance and his grandmother's old blanket reminds us that compassion, whether born out of instinct or quiet guilt, can leave a mark far deeper than we realize. In the later years of life, after walking through storms and carrying the weight of loss, it's easy to grow cautious, to close ourselves off, or to feel like we have nothing left to give. But often it's in those rare moments, when we dare to open our hearts and give, when we let go of the past, that we discover true healing. Elias's simple act didn't just save a life in the snow, it saved his own weary soul. For those who carry regret or sorrow deep within, this truth resonates. It's never too late to reach out, to make amends, and to begin again. Sometimes helping someone else isn't just about them. It's the very thing that allows us to find our way home. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can alter the course of a life, not just for the one receiving it, but for the one giving it. Elias Vance's story reminds us that compassion, even when misunderstood, carries a power far greater than fear or prejudice. In our later years, it's easy to close off, to protect what little we have left. But true healing often begins when we risk opening our hearts again. Letting go of the past doesn't mean forgetting it, means making space for new purpose. It's never too late to find belonging, and sometimes home is where your courage leads you. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.